I'm Maria, and I'm doing this presentation for the Astrology group, who invited me to do a talk on astrology 2 days ago. This is January 2024. But unfortunately, the audio from that presentation did not come out properly. There was no audio, actually. I don't know what happened. So I am recording this again for the group and also for the people on YouTube who were not there and might want to listen. So this is a talk on light. I was asked to present on whatever topic I wanted, and this is one of my favorite topics, so I decided to speak on light. And some of you may know this as sect in traditional astrology, those of you who do traditional astrology. But I like to call it light because I get into a little bit more detail on what actually light is and what its relationship is to the other planets in the chart. And it's helped me to understand sect better. I always found that a difficult topic. I never really was very sold on how I learned sect in my school years when I was studying astrology. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and present this in a different way. So I should preface this talk by explaining a little bit that my type of astrology that I do is traditional but also modern in a way. It's a kind of a hybrid of the two. I just use whatever actually works, but I like to understand things in a way that is more meaningful to me. So I asked a lot of questions when I was studying astrology that I didn't find good answers for. So I decided to research astrology in my early years of studying in a linguistic way. So I approached astrology from kind of a linguistic perspective, looking at it grammatically, because I always found that I learned a lot of astrological vocabulary, but I didn't know how to put the sentences together. And I think a lot of people who study astrology initially get frustrated with this. I did find a lot of rules in the traditional approach that were really helpful, and I do use a lot of them, and you'll see that my astrology technically is very traditional, but in terms of interpretation, it's its own thing. Hopefully I'll be able to explain this in a way that makes sense to you. So that is the grammatical approach that I started with, was how I came to understand astrology more deeply. And that's what I teach in my course online. If you like this talk, you can go to my website. It's down in the description. I'm going to put this on YouTube as well, so you can also find it there. And you can learn more about my work, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. But I do want to let you know that this talk is a little advanced in terms of some assumptions I make about what you know, because the group I'm presenting to a lot of them are advanced in astrology, so I think were able to follow this quite well. But for those of you who are new to astrology, and you have difficulty following chart explanations, there are some charts in this that I'm going to read. I'm not going to do a lot of chart reading in this presentation. I am just going to talk about the planets and how light affects them and how they change depending on sect. But I will do some interpretation of some positions in a couple of sample charts. So if you're not really familiar with how to read a chart, this may look a little advanced, but it's not. It's just, I don't think you'll have trouble following because it's mostly on the planets. But you can always look in on my website and look at some of the articles that are there that are free, and it'll explain a lot of my approach that I'm working with in this presentation as well. Okay, so Yeah, so let's get started with the discussion on light. Okay. Okay, so just want to make sure the audio is on this time. Okay, so what is light? Light is, so anytime you want to understand something in astrology that you don't understand very well, whether it's technical or whether it's something to do with interpretation, it's always good to go back to the basics, right? What I call first principles. Go back to the very basic thing you know about a thing. Start there and build from that. So when we're trying to understand what light is and what it's doing in the chart in general, we want to just define it. What is it? What is light? Well, light is that which provides clarity and illumination. That's basically what light, a definition of light. That's the function of light, right? To provide clarity and illumination so that we see in the world. However, there's a deeper way to understand that, and every definition, well, the words that we use are important because there's an external reality to the words, but there's also an internal, more deep reality to the words. So we're seeing, but through our senses, that's sense seeing, but we're also seeing in the mind, right? We're also seeing things in our mind when we are going about our way in the world. So clear seeing in the mind or on our path is part of the meaning of light, right? Not just sense seeing, but clear seeing in the mind, which is also called awareness, being aware, being clear-sighted about something. Because when and I use the metaphor of life as a journey in my course, in all the astrology that I do, even in my client work that I used to do, I would always use this metaphor as life as a journey. And it's a really good one because we are walking through our life, we are navigating our life, and the ancient Hellenistic astrologers did use the metaphor of a ship going through the journey, our journey in life, as a ship on its own journey. So we need clear sight to be able to see on our journey. So clarity in the mind is just as important as clarity in our journey. And what happens when we have a lot of light, right? And there's no obstructions through weather or anything like that. The more light we have, the farther we can see. And if we can see far and wide, we can see lots of roads and we can see lots of paths. And we can choose more clearly because we can see not only which path is better for us, but we can see far ahead to see how far it continues to be better for us. Excuse me. So clear seeing occurs both in the senses, but what we're talking about here is light that provides clarity in the mind. So that is what light does for us in a chart. It provides clarity in our lives. So that illumination illuminates many possibilities. So light also opens up options that we can't see when it's dark. Another way in which light functions is because it provides all of these different possibilities that we can see, roads that we can travel. We also have more creativity. And the reason is because we can see different options, right? So creativity is not just artistic. Creativity is the ability to solve problems, right? To see ways of solving problems that are not obvious. That is creativity, right? When we can see options that no one else can see, that is a form of creativity because we're solving problems in a way that's unique to us. Another way that light provides something else that it provides is a better sense of morality. And the reason is because things are more well defined when there's greater light, right? So we can define what's good and what's bad more easily because for ourselves, whatever that may be. we can define that better because light provides crisper edges, better definitions to things, right? Things are not as black or as gray because there's not rough edges around everything. Things are more crisply defined. So our moral choices become clearer. Inspiration is another thing that is provided by greater light, and this is because we can see more options. So we are inspired. It's tied to creativity in a way because we can be inspired by different things because we can see them. We can see more solutions. We can see more resources. So resourcefulness is also tied to better light. So we can work with the world in a more efficient way because we can see more products and we can see more options and we can see more roads. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, that light is important in all these practical ways that are actually quite deep in a way, because this is what makes up someone spiritual, is someone who can have greater access to clear seeing, creativity, morality, inspiration, and resourcefulness. These are all aspects of someone who is more spiritual in a way because they have at their hands the ability to solve problems and to see things in a better light. Okay. That phrase in itself, in a better light, is a metaphor for what we're talking about. So when we light a candle, we're invoking a greater sense of illumination within and without, right? We're not just lighting a candle to some deity. We're actually asking for greater clear seeing in the mind and in our soul. Okay, so that's light. Now, we need to talk about the different kinds of light in the chart. So we know having light is good, right? Having light is better than not having light because we have more things open up to us when we have light. But then there's different kinds of light. There is the diurnal light, which is the light of the day, right? From morning to dusk. And there is the nocturnal light, which is the light afforded by the moon, which is a more diffused light, right? It's a softer light. So in the Babylonian system or calendar and their culture, which extends to their astrology as well, in their calendar had two seasons, just two, a summer and a winter. And they actually had two New Years that they celebrated. One in March, or what we would call March. They had their own name, but it corresponded to the sign of Aries. And then one in September, which corresponded to the other equinox in the sign of Libra. So the two equinox points, right, at the horizon, are the points of the New Year's for them, the start of the summer and the start of the winter. And the summer, why is the summer associated with the diurnal light? Well, that's obvious because during the summer months, there's a predominance of daylight. The hours in which there's day are longer than the hours in which there's night. So the summer is associated with light, with the diurnal light, but also the principle of selection. Now, every planet has a principle associated with one principle, and there's one word that I use, and these words that are associated with the principles, 90% of them come from Schmidt. I think I may have tweaked around a few of them and adopted my own words for some that I thought were better, but I will tell you the words that he said for the two lights because I think they're good and they're useful and they're appropriate. So the principle of selection is associated with the sun, and I never understood this. Well, I didn't understand this originally in the beginning, and until I started kind of reading about the sun and thinking more deeply about it. And I did some work on, I wrote an article for the NCGR Journal a long time ago on solar deities, and I had to do some research on that. And then all of the historical work I did with solar deities in antiquity kind of made this clear. But I'll tell you a few interesting things about this. So why selection? Well, just think of light for a moment. And if you think of a spotlight, which is how the sun works, is how it functions in relationship to the moon. So the solar light focuses its light on the earth. And when it's shining, there are things that are in light, and then there's things that are in shadow, right? It creates shadows. So there's the light part and the shadow part. So lighting something with the sun is a lot like a spotlight, where some things are selected, but other things are not. They're out of that light. So it's like of all the things that exist in the world, the sun is selecting some things from that group of things. So it is a process of selection that the sun does through its kind of beam-like quality. You think of it as a spotlight, that the light that comes from the sun. So that principle of selection is really important with the sun. The other interesting thing about the solar deities from antiquity, and this is why in antiquity the solar deities were all deities to which you would swear oaths and contracts or pledges. So if you wanted to make a promise, you would swear it to the sun god. And I was like, why is that? And then after I thought about it for a minute, it came to me. It's okay. What happens that is so reliable? That's the question I asked. What is so reliable about the sun? Oh, it rises, right? It rises every day. It doesn't matter what the weather is like. It always rises. Unless something catastrophic happens to the earth itself, the sun will always rise over the horizon. So for ancient man, that's what they saw. They saw the sun always rising. For someone who doesn't know how the astronomy works, this was rather reliable, right? It's rather, if there is a sun moving this object in the sky every day, then it's a very reliable god. So the god associated with the sun became the god of oaths and contracts, things you pledge to, because you will not go back on that promise. And so that's one thing that was really interesting about the solar deities. But this principle also extends to, there are other functions of the sun god, and the diurnal light specifically. So what happens if you think about ancient man, right? And you think about even before there were civilizations, right? Nomadic man or hunter-gatherer man, right? That lived in caves or that lived in huts or whatever. The earliest thinking man, what did they do? Well, they rose with the sun, right? And they did things during the day. They hunted, they fished, they created things, they built things, they were active during the day. And then this is before electricity, so there are no lights at night. So as soon as the sun is gone, and we're not well adapted, humans are not well adapted to see at night. So we stop our activities during the night and we rest and we go to sleep and we huddle with our clan, with our families or our friends and with our groups. And we go to bed at night. So the sun is the diurnal sect, the diurnal light, is very much associated, and associations over time create imprints. They create imprints in individuals, but also in societies and in histories. So the imprint that was created for early man with the daylight is externally oriented, right? It's an externally oriented activity level. So that is what happens with the diurnal chart. It becomes an externally oriented natal mission. And I use the word natal mission because this, for a diurnal chart, the sun is the indicator of what we're doing here, okay? We are here, the sign that the sun is in for diurnal births will tell you what your mission is. That is your mission. That sign need and its placement in that house tells you what your mission is. And when I do client charts, when I used to do client charts, I've stopped doing them right now to work on other projects, writing and teaching, but eventually I'll go back to doing some client work. But I do want to get some writing projects done. But in any event, these missions, I do give clients their mission, helps us to understand the bigger picture of what's going on in our lives, and especially this work with light, which you'll see at the end of this presentation, that this work with light is extremely important in everything, in the reason why we're here and what we're doing here and how we can best navigate this mortal coil that we have. Okay, so the solar mission is externally oriented. There is a greater awareness of self with a diurnal chart, because the point of the diurnal mission is a process of individuation and self-fidelity, okay? Awareness of self is about finding out who we are as individuals and being true to that person, okay? That is the self-fidelity and individuation process. And it is part of the diurnal mission. All of us that are here that are born during the day, this is part of what we're doing here. And you can see this by the fact that you can look at the words and see what they're associated with. And individuation is a process associated with both Aries and Leo, the two signs. Aries more about individualization, becoming an individual apart from our caretakers and others in general. And Leo is about our identity and finding out who we are. Now, these two signs are the signs that the sun has exaltation over, Aries, and domicile rulership over, which is Leo. So these two signs are very important to the sun. And if you look at your chart, if you are a diurnal chart, the house where Aries is very important in your mission as well. It's not your mission. The mission is the sun, where the sun is and its sign. But that Aries house will figure into that mission in a way that is exalted. In other ways, the sun's activity, whatever the sun does in the chart, will exalt the house where Aries is in. And I'm going to show you an example of that. But in my own chart, I'm a diurnal birth, and I have the sun in Gemini in the 11th house. But Aries is on my 9th house, which is the house of astrology. It's also the house of foreign lands, and I'm also an immigrant here. So in the U.S., I have been here since I was a kid. And my life has been exalted abroad, so yes. But also astrology, my activities have exalted that area of my life. So, okay, the other thing is the path of accomplishment and affirmation is part of the solar mission. Accomplishment is tied to Saturn, which is one of the solar sect mates, and affirmation is tied to Jupiter, which is the other sect mate of the sun. So if you're not familiar with sect, for those of you who are not that well versed in traditional astrology, the sun and moon are like two political parties. This is how my teacher, Demetra George, likes to speak of it. And so I would like to think of them as two groups. Political parties a little bit too charged these days. But so you have let's say it's your two parents, right? You have your father and your mother. And so they have helpers, right? And the helpers are the planets that like to be with that planet. So Saturn and Jupiter like to be with the sun. They are part of the solar diurnal sect. And then Venus and Mars like to be with the moon. They're part of the nocturnal sect. And there's reasons for this, and I'll get into some of this a little bit, but not the history of it. But and then Mercury, which always goes both ways, can can go with the sun, can go with the moon, but it depends on where he is relative to the sun. So if he rises before the sun, he's more of a nocturnal. He's more goes with the moon, right? He's more of a, I said before, I meant after the sun. If he rises, the sun rises first and he rises after, he's a feminine, so a setting Mercury. And if he rises before, he's more masculine. He goes with the sun. So Mercury can go both ways. You just can remember that, depending on where he is relative to the sun. If he's rising before the sun, he's more of diurnal. If he's rising after the sun, he's more nocturnal. So the ultimate goal of a diurnal chart is the goal to inspire. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but it is to inspire something in the world, right? Whether someone else or yourself, or it's to leave behind a spark that seeds something to someone else, something positive, preferably. Okay, now the challenges to a diurnal chart will come from the moon, because that is the light that is not in sect, right? And there are challenges because we're more unfamiliar with this territory. It's not because it's negative or bad or nothing like that. It's because we're unfamiliar with this territory and we can make mistakes. And I'm going to talk more about how things can go wrong when things are out of sect. But I just want to establish here the two differences in how we look at the world. So before telling you about the challenges of the moon, let me just skip to what the moonlight actually does, and then I'll go back. So if the sun is the summer, the moon is symbolic of the winter, because the moon predominates in the months of winter, right? The nocturnal hours of light are more prevalent in the winter than in the summer. This, of course, in the northern hemisphere. Now, the principle that is associated with the moon, Schmidt called inclusion. And Robert Schmidt's work is the work that I have, I already mentioned, am using for all of the planets. But the word he used for the moon is inclusion, and I think that's a good word. There are other words associated with the moon, like gathering, collecting. And why these words? Well, the gathering and collecting actually goes back to Babylon, and there's a myth associated with that. I'm not going to go into that. It's too long, but I will tell you, if you think of the lunar light, and I don't think the Babylonians knew this, I'm not sure, but nevertheless, it's in their myth. But if you look at the lunar light, what happens? It doesn't generate its own light, right? The moon actually reflects the light of the sun. That's why we see it. It's reflecting the light of the sun. It doesn't generate its own light. So what the moon does is it receives the light, and then it gathers and reflects it back into the world. And that's essentially the principle of the lunar light, is to receive, gather, collect, nurture that light, and then to put it out into the world again. And if you think of the process of procreation, and you think of the seed as the sun, and the womb as the moon, right, the father and the mother, that is exactly what happens. The seed is symbolic of the thing that is inseminating, or you could say inspiring, right, creation. And the moon is the thing, the womb is the thing that's receiving the seed, receiving that light, nurturing it in an enclosure, right, the womb, and then putting it out into the world as a new thing, as a created thing. So that is essentially what happens with the lunar mission. The lunar mission, because of this receptive quality to it, is internally oriented. And this external-internal divide or separation or distinction is probably the most important one in navigating your way through a chart. When you're internally oriented, your mind becomes very important, and your emotions, right? Because that's what's internal, your mind and your emotions. And what you do with that ends up shaping what you put out into the world, what you create in the world, what you sort of take in and how you process that, right, through our psychology ends up being a great influence on how we see the world, and how we see the world ends up affecting how we navigate our way through it. So this growth in the world, the reception of the light and the development is really what we're doing here in a nocturnal mission, is receiving from the world and developing something and creating something, giving form to it. So there's some very tangible quality to the mission of the moon. Even though it's internal, there is this outer product that comes from that. The path of attachment and security is part of that mission, because what are the signs that the moon has exaltation of is Taurus. In Taurus, it has to do with attachment and security. The need for attachment, the need for resources, and the need for security, material security primarily. So the moon is going to uplift, just like the sun does with Aries. The moon uplifts the house, the things of the house. So if you are a nocturnal birth and you look at the house that has Taurus on it, that house will be important in your mission. It will be important in the things you end up doing as your mission. It will be uplifted. So the ultimate goal of a lunar mission is to nurture something in the world, to bring it into light as a material form. Okay, so if we go back to the challenges from the moon, now you have a better sense of what the moon is doing. The challenges in a diurnal birth will be the things that the moon is strong at, if you're a nocturnal birth. But in a diurnal birth, you're not familiar with it, so you won't be good at it. You might have trouble with nurturing and gathering. That doesn't mean you personally, but it could be in your life. This theme of nurturing and gathering may be a source of problems for you. It may be something that you end up, you might do it, but you might be resentful about doing it, or you might have some kind of trigger around that, or you might meet someone who's excessively doing this in your life. That happened with me. So someone who is a little bit too excessively possessive, that kind of thing. So there are going to be issues around this theme. Schmidt says there are mistakes of inclusion, which is the lunar word, right? Inclusion, the principle of inclusion, mistakes of doing that. I have a diurnal chart, so for me, the moon is in the second house, which is a house of money. And in my early years, when I was a teenager, young adult, I would say, I got a job as a teller to make money to go to school. My son is in Gemini, and going to school was really important for me. And I needed money. My parents did not have money, and I worked. And I was a teller for a long time, but for a long time, too long, that was a mistake of inclusion. I saw that as a mistake. And that career path, which I did for a long time, was not one that I liked. That was not one I wanted to continue. But I did it because I needed the money, until I understood, and I'll get into this in a minute, but this, the non-dominant light then becomes a helper to you in a way, if you learn to use it. But it's seen as a mistake in your early years. Because the moon, the nocturnal, remember, hunter-gatherer man in the clans, they're oriented towards the group. So there's a consideration of others is important in a nocturnal sect. But if you're a diurnal, this can be problematic because you're more oriented on yourself, on your own development, on your own individuation. So anything that interferes with this mission can be seen as a problem, especially if it's excessive, right? And we have a tendency to see the nocturnal as intrusive if we have a diurnal. So these will be things, and I wrote this word consideration here with the Latin because I thought it was cool. It comes from, and by the way, as an aside, this again goes back to the linguistic thing. If you want to understand something, look at the etymology of words. The etymology of words are really interesting, and they tell you a lot about what the word is supposed to mean and its deeper meaning. So I looked at this word, and this word comes from the Latin con, which means with, and sideration comes from sideris, which means star. So it's with stars. So consideration is an awareness of being with stars, right? So when we consider something and we look at something, it is like looking at light. It's like looking at the stars. So I thought that was cool. Anyway, in a nocturnal birth, there's a focus on others, consideration of others above self. So that can be problematic in a diurnal birth, which is about awareness of self, not others. We tend to defer to others in a nocturnal birth, and that can interfere with our own process. Healthy development of the mental and the emotional. So that can also interfere, because in the diurnal, we're oriented towards the development of authenticity and ego and identity. So development of mental and emotional often occurs with interpersonal relationships and our own history with other people. So this can become an issue in some of the challenges for the nocturnal, for those born in diurnal from the nocturnal. Okay, the challenges from the diurnal side, if you're nocturnal, have to do with the executive function, decision making, and problem solving. So some nocturnal people will have periods where, they'll either be too passive or they'll be deferring to others. They will have trouble deciding their own path. It could be challenges in what are you going to do? For example, I am not, like I said, I am a diurnal birth, but when I got married, and I'll talk about the phases in a minute later, but when I got married, my sun set and I became a nocturnal, and that was a difficult time for me, particularly around career, because my whole path was about career, and I deferred. Again, the focus went towards others, right? Towards the partnership, towards the home, towards that. There was a shift there in the change in phase. And I had a real time deciding my career path, because the path that I was on had to change because of my husband's path. So my chart went nocturnal, and so I had a real hard time with this, and had to sort of adapt my path to a different way of being. So there are mistakes of selection, and there could be problems with awareness of self. Like I said, you will start deferring to others more. Maybe you have a child, maybe you have a family that you have to look after, or it's an awareness away from self. So there are challenges to yourself if you are if you're nocturnal and you are in a diurnal phase. You are forced to look at yourself more. Because your natural tendency is not to. And there are challenges about development of authenticity and ego, because these things are not familiar to you. Okay, whoops. So here's a comparison. I wanted to give you a compare and contrast to give you a sense of, in the world, of what this looks like. That's not, just astrological. So I picked the self-help industry, and I wanted to talk about these two ways of approaching the self-help industry. So Gabor Mate is a psychologist who does therapy, and he does a very internally oriented type of self-help. He's basically, when we do therapy, we're basically looking at we're looking within. We're looking at our feelings. We're looking at our past experiences. We're looking at our emotions. We're looking at how we feel, how we perceive our experiences in early childhood. He does this kind of work. And it's a very lunar type of therapy, right? Very internally oriented. And whereas Mark Manson, I don't know if you're familiar with him, and it's funny that Gabor Mate's photo is a little darker, and then Mark Manson's is a little lighter. That was an accident. It was not by design, but it's kind of funny that happened. Coincidence. But Mark Manson's work, he wrote The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but I actually listen to his podcast, and I find him really interesting the way he talks about stuff. But his work, it's not really like therapy, it's more like coaching, right? And so he's talking about his approach is very action-oriented. It's prescriptive. It's not about reflecting. It's more about a prescription to work your way out of a problem, right? To kind of redevelop new habits, do these things, right? Challenge yourself to certain things. He's also very oriented on self-improvement, about discipline, which is very Saturnian. Those are the solar sect mates. So he's very, and in fact, if you watch YouTube, you see that it's more like coaching rather than therapy. That's the first difference. And the other thing you notice is that in YouTube, this type of self-help is very male dominated. I don't know if anybody's noticed that, but the therapeutic side of therapy, right, the psychological kind of therapy type of self-help online is more dominated by women, I find. It's interesting to see that online, because I watch a lot of YouTube. I don't actually watch TV much. I do watch a lot of YouTube, and I find that there are a lot of female coaches. That's true, but I do find that there's this self-help trend with a lot of self-improvement by males who are, and specifically addressing males who want to be more productive, be more disciplined, be more active, be more healthy, all these things. So I find that's interesting. But the other curious thing about this is that Gabor Mate, despite the fact that his type of therapy is very lunar, it's a lot like the yin-yang symbol. You see that the symbol, the diurnal part of it, the yang part of it has the black dot in it, right? And the nocturnal part of it has the white part in it too. It's like the inside of each of the parts is a seeding of the other. And that is what helps it transform into the other. It helps it transmute into the thing that it's not. And you can actually see this in Gabor Mate's work. And actually in Mark Manson's too, like in Gabor Mate's work, even though his type of therapy is very lunar, what he's talking about, the content of what he's talking about is very solar. He's talking about authenticity, right? And individuality and being self-fidelity and being able to defend and know who you are and be clear about who you are. That's a very identity-oriented, solar-oriented content. But the style and even his manner of speaking is very soft and very lunar. And with Manson, it's the opposite. He is very stylistically very solar, very externally oriented, very action-oriented. But he's also talking about things that affect interpersonal relationships and families and even countries. His videos, he's actually gone to countries and tried to identify patterns in the society as a whole, which is very collective and inclusive. That's very lunar in content. So you see the symbol here. It's very interesting. You see these dots, even in the very distinctive solar-lunar dichotomy that we're talking about. And that's really fascinating. And I hadn't even noticed that until I put this presentation together. I hadn't even noticed that till I actually started looking closer at it. So, yeah, I find that fascinating. Okay, so what happens with the non-dominant light? So our chart is either nocturnal or diurnal, but then we have this other light that is not dominant, right? What is that light doing? Well, the non-dominant light is very important as well. That luminary supports the mission of the dominant light, right? It's not just an antagonist. It's not there to like trip you up. It's there to support the mission. But it trips you up until you start integrating it because you think it's there to trip you up. You're not seeing it as, you know, your reaction is to not, it doesn't feel familiar. It feels unfamiliar, not very comfortable. So we don't see it as a support, but it can be there as a support if you know how to integrate it. But nonetheless, you are susceptible to perceive mistakes with that other light, with the non-dominant light. Especially in the beginning before you start really integrating it. So this light will indicate a way of seeing the world that is unfamiliar to us, but which we have to learn to value and master in support of that larger mission. Now, it doesn't have to be a direct support. It can be indirect, but it does, excuse me, it does tend to want to be integrated if you allow it to. So when the moon is non-dominant, meaning your diurnal birth and your moon is non-dominant, the inclusion of the matter, so the matter, when I say the matter, I'm talking about the topic, but I'm also talking about the terrestrial plane, right, because it's matter, and the terrestrial plane is where the houses are. So the inclusion of the matter of the place where it resides, meaning the light. So wherever the moon is by house, that matter, that topic, will support the mission, but may also be perceived as a mistake during the life, just like my moon in the second in my banking work. My moon is opposite Saturn. Saturn's in the 8th house of banking, and the moon is collecting money, so I was a teller, and I saw that as a mistake in my career direction. But later on, I did integrate it. I did manage to integrate it, not through banking, through another way of collecting money, which I won't get into, but it was not my primary career that I wanted, which was the astrology career, but it was a way of supporting my astrology career. I made my money separately through real estate, which is a lunar asset, and that supported my research work in astrology. So it ended up being a support. And with the sun, if you are a nocturnal birth, the sun will be your support. So the selection, here it's inclusion, that's a lunar word, here it's selection, of the topics of the house, right, the place where it resides. Place is another word for house. In Greek, they use that word, topos, meaning place. You will recognize that topos, right, meaning in Greek place, is also the root of the word topography, which is the terrain, the houses, and it's also the root of the word topic, which is the matter that is in the houses. So the selection of whatever topic is in that house, right, where the sun is, will support your mission, your lunar mission, but may also be perceived as a mistake sometime during your life. Okay, so now let's talk about, so now that you have an idea of the distinction between lunar and solar charts, night and day charts, I wanted to talk about this integration of them, right? And you can see the integration if you make statements about the positions of the sun and moon. you can integrate those statements into a mission statement. I call this an integrated mission statement. But you can also see the direction of the movement of the light. So if the luminary is the sun, and in antiquity the sun is the symbol of the soul, and I still adhere to that. It is a symbol of the soul, and it's clear in the chart that it is. And the moon is a symbol of the world. Now, it's interesting that the sun spends its time in the world, right, in the outer world, in the daylight, doing activity. So there's this relationship here, cross-relationship between the sun and the world. And there's this cross-relationship between the moon and the soul, because the moon spends a lot of time internally looking at our emotions, which is our our passage into the soul is through our emotions. So the moon does internal work on the soul. So there's this connection, even though the moon refers to the outer world and the sun refers to the soul, but there's this connection, and the connection comes through this, what I call a wave of motion of light. And the wave of motion of the sun, so let me explain how you could see this. So if you put yourself here, right, and you put the world here on this side, you're here, the direction of the wave of motion of the sun comes from within. So you're here, it comes from within, outward. You spend your time in the world doing action here. This is where the action happens. And then that action comes back and seeds something within. Now, it seeds something within you, but it also seeds something within other people as well. So the nurturing comes first. That's the lunar part, right? It comes from within, goes out into the world, right? And then it comes back in as a seeding into the soul. Just like in procreation, the seed comes from out into the world and back into the womb and seeds something there. So the action is in the external world. This is where we spend most of our solar mission time, is here. And the power that it has is the power of animation. That's the formal power. This is the matter and this is the form. If we want to look at that duality, that philosophical duality, which I do use in my work quite a bit in the grammar. So the animation is the thing that animates the soul. That's the divine solar energy that animates the soul. And the growth is the power of the world to grow things, right? The power to nurture and develop in material form. And so the power comes from the outer world. So this is the outer world, right? It comes from here. It goes inside. This is where we spend our lunar time in the internal world, right? Nurturing, processing. And then we create outwardly into the outer world. We create something tangible, something actually physical, right? That's the growth. So it's the perceiving, that's the internal, and then the creation on the outer level. So it's the reverse of this. So you can kind of see it visually, what's happening with the lights. And here you see it in an integrated statement that I've been working with. And you can use different words. You can use these. If they don't work, you can switch the words around to different lunar words or different solar words. But this works pretty well. I did this for a bunch of celebrity charts, and it all pretty much targeted the very things that they were doing from what I know about their biographies in life. So by nurturing something, and the something will come from the position of the moon in the house, right? Nurturing is the moon. The thing that it's nurturing comes from the house, so of the moon. So by nurturing something in the world, right? Nurturing what comes from the world, nurturing inside what comes from the world. This way. By nurturing something in the world comes from outside here. One seeds an idea in the soul. That's the position of the sun. So this is the final mission, but it starts with the lunar part. just like it started with me with banking. First, I nurtured the material thing. And that was true in astrology too. First I nurtured, because my moon is in Virgo, and that was the actual techniques that I was collecting, that I was working with. I was nurturing, developing, integrating, processing all of that internally, but actually out in the world by talking and teaching and all that. And then I seed an idea in the soul, which was what I'm hoping to do with the work that I'm producing. In the lunar mission, by perceiving an idea in the mind, right, and that's the sun's position, by perceiving an idea in the mind, one creates something in the world, and that's the moon's position. Okay, so you can play around with this, and I've done this with some of the two charts that I'm going to show you here. Okay, these two charts, and I actually did it with another one that I'm going to show you, but this one here is quite literal. They actually both are pretty good at targeting, but this one's easy to see in his chart. And so John Lennon, right, of the Beatles, has his sun. He's a nocturnal birth. He has his moon here in Aquarius in the 10th. He has a sun in the 6th, but in the 7th sign. The moon is in the 11th sign, but in the 10th. Now, when this happens, I use equal houses, by the way. I don't want to get into a whole thing about house systems, but the reason I do this, so I ruled out the quadrant systems just because of their, they don't work well in the higher latitudes, and that's a problem for me. I had some clients up in higher latitudes. So, and then all my testing then ended up working well with equal. But what I find in the choice between, I know a lot of people, a lot of traditional astrologers use whole sign because of Chris Brennan's work and because of Schmidt's work. He also, I think, taught with whole sign. And I find that what I do with equals is very much like whole signs because I'm interpreting by sign. But and it's not wrong to do whole signs. You will not get a wrong answer. You do need 30 degrees per house. That is why I removed the quadrant options. But when it comes down to whole sign and equal, whole sign will work. If you have the sun here, it'll say the same thing, except if you have equal and you have the overlap of sign and house, what happens is that you get an intersection of sets of nouns, and it allows you to narrow down your nouns. So now let's interpret, and you can see this, what I'm talking about. So the sun is a selection principle, right? And his sun is selecting what? Selecting, if we use whole sign, it would be in the 7th, right? In Libra, 7th house would be all here. So he would be selecting a partner, which is correct. But it's correct because that was a large part, a very important part of his mission in his life was his work with his partners, primarily Paul McCartney, but also with Yoko Ono. But if you use equal and the sign overlaps the 6th and 7th, it's not just a partner, like a marriage partner, it's actually a working partner. And that is the detail you get with equal that you might miss. Because if we saw the sun just here and then we saw the moon just in the 11th, we might miss that this mission had a lot to do with his work, his creative work, his artistic work in music. So what we get with the 6th, 7th is the specification of this working relationship, which he also had with Yoko Ono. He also worked with her creatively. And that's one of the reasons that he married her, was for her creative, her ability to inspire him creatively. So, okay, so that overlap is important, which is the reason why I use equal. Equal, whole sign is not wrong, and you can use whole sign, but I find equal gives me more detail with this overlap technique. So we do the sun first because he's a nocturnal birth, right? By perceiving the need to collaborate. The collaboration comes from Libra, the need to collaborate. The signs are needs. And Libra is a sign of the need to collaborate, right? By perceiving the need to collaborate with a working partner, right? The 6th, 7th. I said another, but it's really a working partnership here. He creates the gathering of a group in the world. Not only a group, because it's 11th, but it's a group that is connected to his occupation, his career, right? And the group was, of course, the Beatles. So he actually is the one who gathered and collected the members of the group. He's the one who started the group. He's the one who recognized the need to collaborate with Paul McCartney because he was not as musically talented as Paul was. Paul was more classically trained and had a better musical repertoire than Lennon did. And he recognized that, and he knew that he needed to work with someone like that. So he selected this selection, and included the members that would become the Beatles in that bringing forth the group into the world. So that was his mission. He accomplished his mission in his life. He actually did something. And the need for this group was as a form of inclusion. He wanted to feel a sense of inclusion that he didn't get, probably from having lost his mother at a young age. But I'm not going to go into his whole biography, but it's quite interesting, his life. So with Diana, she's got the solar, remember the solar chart. And so we start with the moon. By nurturing and gathering, nurturing, a lunar word, gathering is a lunar word, right? The gathering of information. Nurturing is this lunar mission. Gathering is the actual verb of the object, which is the third, is documents and information. So by nurturing this gathering of information, she seeds the need to protect against death, but also, so here, 7-8, we have an overlap between 7-8. Now this is a situation of danger. So there are ways of reading this, there are many ways of reading this, because we have the partner and we have his resources. That's one way of reading this. We also have the partner and anxieties that come from the partner, which she experienced in her relationship. But we also have the 8th house has death, and death affecting other people in general. So all of these things actually relate to her and her life. And this need for protection comes from Cancer. That is the need that Cancer indicates. And it's because Cancer so there are historical reasons for this that go back to the Babylonian culture that I won't get into here. It will take too long to explain. But if you just think of the crab as an animal that has an external shell, right? And that external shell is like an armor that protects him. And that is a metaphor for this sign in many ways, because it indicates that, and remember, this sign occurs at the darkest part of night, which is the midnight part down here in the natural zodiac, not in her chart, but in the natural zodiac. So I'm talking now about the meaning of the sign. And it is a point of, the darkest part is the point of greatest anxieties and fears. And why do we have the greatest anxieties and fears at the darkest point? Because it's the point where we can't see anything. So there are actual dangers when there's no light. There are predators, right, at night in the ancient world, and before there was electricity, and before there was shelter to protect you, right? So the Cancer represents the shelter, the part that protects you. It's either your home, right? Because that is the 4th house, is the place of home. But it's also the shelter that protects you and gives you a place to rest and feel safe. So safety is a big concern because it's lacking. So the needs are lax. I'm kind of getting off on a need thing here. A sign lecture or presentation, but I'm trying to kind of help you understand where I'm getting all this stuff. So whenever you see Cancer, it's not just in her chart. Anytime you see Cancer in a chart, there is going to be a need for protection. And because it's in the 8th house of death, that is certainly a danger, right, that she has to be aware of. And how did it play out in her mission? Well, it played out in 2 ways that I know of. Aside from the dangers through her relationship, I don't think they were to her life, although they could have been. I'm not sure. There's a lot of controversy about her death, but I don't think so. But one very tangible way was through her work with the landmines, right? And remember that the sun exalts children in her chart through Aries. So the danger that is perceived through the sun is going to help to exalt children. So it's not only her own children through the danger she sees in her marriage, right, through the nurturing of her own kids, but also through the protection of these kids that are being maimed by landmines, which was an integral part of the work she was doing in her later, just before she died. So her mission about nurturing and gathering information, there was another way I haven't mentioned that has to do with her problems with Jimmy Savile, who was also placing children in danger. He was accused of pedophilia. After his death, this was, I think, even before his death, and she knew about it. And actually, the hospital where he was doing some work, where she was doing some work, she was doing some advocacy there. She found out about what he was doing with children there. He was also involved in the same hospital, and there's some theories that, she wrote a letter to him. There's some theories that she indicated that she knew what he was doing and that she might go public with it. And that might have led to her death. This is a theory that's out there, and I don't know how true it is, but it's certainly supported by this chart. There's also the matter of the landmine issue that made it to the UN, and that got a lot of nations to sign on to some of the protocols that she was pushing or advocating for, and that made a lot of enemies in her world, and that could have caused her death. But so anyway, so the information she was gathering while being beneficial and part of her mission, right, because she has to integrate this moon, the sun and the moon together, she was trying to see the need to protect against death. Okay, she was doing that, and so she was integrating these things in her life at the time when she was prematurely killed. So yeah, this does not mean that her mission was wrong just because they killed her. If it is related to some of this, it doesn't mean that her mission was wrong. It means that she was in a nocturnal sect when she was killed, and so she might have been having problems with some of the integration of Jupiter and being too trusting. Her moon is afflicted through Neptune, so there's lack of transparency here going on with some of her affiliations, especially with regard to the information she was gathering. So she might have been trusting people she shouldn't have trusted. But in any event, and her moon is afflicted by Neptune and Uranus. So it's interesting, but this would have been an important thing that she was doing, and something that would have made her feel very fulfilled to be doing this work, because it impacts both her lives. Okay, so let me just take a sip here to clear my throat. Okay, so let's look at the two things that I want to talk about. Is when there are imbalances in light, I want to talk mostly about the extremes, and also propriety, this issue of propriety, which is part of sect. And I'll explain this in a minute. But okay, so what happens now? Not all of us have the natural situation, right? I'm not saying preferred, but I would say natural is to have the sun above and the moon below. That would be a balanced situation, and the more natural, because the sun is in the daylight and the moon is in the nighttime. So that would be the natural situation, but a lot of people don't have that, right? So it's 1 out of 4 of us have that. So what you would typically, you might have, and I have a description of all 4 conditions possible, but the extremes would be 2 lights above, right? Or no lights above, meaning 2 lights below the hemisphere, the horizon. What happens when you have both lights below is that there's no light above, right? There's nothing to light your way in the world. Both lights are internally focused. Now, I like the image of Arya Stark as a metaphor for this, and I'll explain why. So when you have no lights above, it's dark, right? And when it's dark, it's dangerous because you can't see, there may be predators, there's dangers. So if you're born into a chart that has no lights to guide you above, you are going to be born into a situation that you might perceive as anxiety-ridden. For whatever reason, either it's externally dangerous, like there's actually physical danger to you when you're born, or there is, now John Lennon was born during wartime. Actually, the day he was born, there were bombs falling over London. And not London, he wasn't born in London, but wherever he was born, I think it's Liverpool. There were bombs falling, and the nurses, he had protection. He had 1 light above. So the nurses would put the babies in the hospital under the beds so that if the hospital got hit, the babies would be protected, they thought, or at least partially protected. I don't know. So, but when you have no lights above, this can be external danger, or can be just perceived internal danger. Like it can be something more personal, like a parent who you perceive as anxiety filling for some reason, or a family member, or you're alone, or for whatever reason. There are many reasons that can cause uncertainties or insecurities, right? It doesn't have to be actual physical danger. It can be just a creation of uncertainties and insecurities as a child. And lots of stuff can do that to you as a child. So we have to overcome a fear, because those insecurities and uncertainties become imprinted very early on, and we carry them. So we have to overcome those fears. And because those anxieties and insecurities are going to cause us to fear taking steps in life, right? Taking steps in the outer world. So we need to overcome that. So how we do that is we develop a good relationship with Mars. And this is why I like the image of Arya, if anyone's familiar with Game of Thrones. And she also becomes blind in that show. So in a portion of it where she can't really literally see, and she has to train as a fighter in the dark. And it's brilliant because it's exactly what we are doing internally. We're training ourselves to have a good relationship with our Mars, our protector, our inner protector. So we're doing this, and that's one of the nocturnal sect mates, right? So if we have both lights below, depending on which planet sets first, those will be the planets that will help us out. So if the sun, which planet rises first? So if the sun rises first, this becomes the natural condition, right? Sun above, moon below. So if you have both below, the sun rises first, then you have sun above, moon below, and you get a period where you have support from the solar sect mates. So that means you'll learn to face your uncertainties externally, the solar sect, through necessity, Saturn, right? You'll have to make your way in the world, and through your faith in the world. So through all of the Saturn Jupiter things can help you face your uncertainties, be disciplined and be optimistic. So that'll help you during your diurnal phase. If your moon rises first, then you have the moon above and the sun below. So your moon sect mates become more of an asset for you in learning to navigate these uncertainties. And that's exactly what happens with Arya. With Arya, she learns to face it. She also does some of this, but I think this stands out more to me. She learns to face uncertainties by reaching out to others, right? Venus, and learning self-defense, Mars. She becomes a warrior. Like her whole journey is meeting people who teach her how to fight and how to be a warrior. She also meets people who help her, who become good relationships to her, who end up helping her. Because she's a young girl. She's a very young girl in a very, in a war-torn, mythological fantasy world that is quite violent. So she becomes, she goes on a quest for revenge. So the Mars is really strongly emphasized. So it becomes a good metaphor for someone who is born into a dark exterior. So it's an interesting thing to meditate on and think about if you have this in your own chart and how that plays out. Okay, when both lights are above, this is completely different. And this, excuse me. So I picked this image here with the, with this, dog chasing a frisbee because it denotes action and strong focus, and a very efficient action. So what you get with when both lights are above is a strong external focus on in the world, right? In activity. And this can happen when you have very early demanding early conditions. Like if you have parents that are very demanding and they expect a lot from you and they take you to a lot of activities and they want you to accomplish a lot, and they drive you, or you could have a parent that's just very authoritarian and who is very driven. That tends to be a father because the solar light is dominant. But it doesn't have to be. It could be another male figure in the life. But it promotes this kind of can-do attitude. So you become very autonomous. In attachment theory, these would be the people who might be avoidant, right? Because they're very driven, they're very autonomous, they can do stuff on their own, they don't really need other people. They have trouble with the nocturnal, right? They have trouble with the interpersonal, the social difficulties, but they're very determined and resilient, and they can accomplish a lot. So, but they can also have scattered focus. This depends on whether the sun and Saturn, the conditions of those two, but especially the sun. If the light is very unfocused, they can lose their ability to focus because there's too much light and it's going everywhere. You can have problems with attention problems, attention deficit disorders, stuff like that, or ASD, which is more the interpersonal social stuff. Those can be difficult. So there's always a downside, right? There's pluses and there's minuses. But it's an extreme condition that you have to learn to moderate as you live through your life. So as the light changes, if the sun sets first, right, then you have the moon above and the sun below. So then what you're getting is a focus more turned towards the interpersonal. And because you're very externally oriented, this may be difficult, right, when this change happens. So there may be challenge in relationships, and there may be issues of autonomy or disconnect that come through Mars. So these are the moon's mates that might be a problem for you because you're very externally, diurnally oriented. If the moon sets first, then you get the natural condition, which is the sun above, moon below. So you're going to be still a solar, right? It's still a solar chart because the moon is setting, so it's still a solar chart. So it's still diurnal. It's not as much of a challenge as this one because the solar light's still there. But you're going to, home and family, you're going to be forced to look more at that. You're going to have more awareness through that via your commitment, Saturn, and the support that you give to the people. So you're still going to be externally oriented, but you might have to be externally oriented towards other people in your life that you're going to help through. You might help them through external, logistical, right, commitments to others, through your work that you do, not necessarily your actual career, but through, doing stuff for other people, being there for them, being a help to them in the outer world. So that could be a way in which that comes out. So you can look at this and play around with this and see how that plays out with the different lights. Okay, now here are the luminaries in all 4 light conditions. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I've already kind of summarized all that with the 2 extremes and which one goes down or rises first. But I've included Schmidt's words here just to give you a different kind of spin on it. So for both lights above, he would say, because he puts more weight, he doesn't do the psychological as much. He used to put more weight on these words, inclusion and selection. So with 2 lights above, there's not enough inclusion, right? And what he says, and this is true, it's hard to see until you narrow it down to specific events in the timing, but you can see that the moon is rendered ineffective when you have 2 lights above. And this goes to what I was saying about the interpersonal social difficulties that come from the moon. That's rendered somewhat ineffective. So you could have something like someone who is, and it could be temporarily. It doesn't mean it's in your, in your physical, like it doesn't mean that you have some kind of, psychological disorder or anything, but it could just mean that your situation makes it so that your social life might be neglected more. And the opposite is true when you have 2 lights below. These are more difficult to see, but you have, this is still an external focus, and you have inclusion mistakes. The place where the moon is will tell you where that happens. And as the chart turns, and you see the moon going through the signs, or through the houses and signs, you can see where that happens, and it happens in a different way each time. Each 7-year period, there'll be a different way in which you might have inclusion mistakes. It's not always going to be as dramatic as it sounds. Sometimes it won't be that big a deal, but you will see this happen. Here, with both lights below, not selective enough because there is no solar light, right? The sun is rendered ineffective. And I can give you a personal example of this with me. So I'm a diurnal chart, right? But my sun went below when I got married, and my moon went below when I bought real estate, and my sun was still below. So the moon was just here in the 6th house. It had just set, and the sun was in the 4th. And I had bought real estate. I had selected properties, right? I had bought real estate to manage. And I was doing property management, and I was really not that great at being selective with my tenants. So I just gave everybody a house, and that ended up being a mistake because I wasn't selective enough. So my properties got trashed quite a bit because I wasn't doing my due diligence in checking backgrounds and doing stuff like that. I just felt sorry for everyone, and I would give them a house. So, so that's an actual example of literally what Schmidt writes here. But it is, and yes, there were anxieties over that. It is a problem of excessive inclusion, and it was a problem where the sun was, right? Sun in the house of property. And the moon here in the tenant house, which is the 6th. So, yeah, this sometimes can be very literal. You'll see when you start working with this, but you have to really look and apply the language to see it. Okay, so the sect phases. Okay, this has to do with the turning, right? And I don't want to do a whole thing on the turning here, and whether it's, I don't want to do a talk on timing, on this timing technique, but this technique is a technique that I work with, and me and my students are probably the only ones that know this technique because I developed it from the Babylonian work that I was doing. And I wrote about it. It's on my website. You can read about it, so I'm not going to explain too much. But it's basically the nuts and bolts of it, the long and short of it is that you take your natal chart and you just turn it clockwise and at the rate of 7 years per house. That's it. That's basically it. And that will give you, now one of the, after the presentation that I gave, one of the members there asked me through text why it is I use this timing technique, and it's a good question. And the reason I use it is because it's the only technique I find that can outline your life in broad strokes, chronologically in the right order, without me having to fish around for what I'm looking for. So that's the reason why I use it. I was looking for something like this. I didn't develop this because I was looking for it. I actually developed this as a byproduct of the work that I did with analyzing Gilgamesh, the story of Gilgamesh in the Babylonian culture. And I did a talk on the houses and how the houses are related to that, because that story is very astrological. And then I realized when I was playing around with that whole circle of the journey of Gilgamesh, which is an astrological journey, it's a journey through place and time, I realized that I was focused on the place element of it, the terrestrial portion of it, and which is why I did a whole a talk on the houses from it. But there's also a time component to it because the Babylonians are doing both. They're always doing time and place. So space and time are intimately two sides of the same coin. So this notion of time in the circle was what led to this timing technique and my playing around with it. Then when I was trying to decide what name I should give this, someone asked what I called this, and I call it the turning method. And the reason I call it that is because that's all it is. But also when I was looking for, I had read in the Hellenistic astrological literature about the turning of the times, and I was trying to find more information about that. And I was Googling around for the turning of the times in Hellenistic astrology. And I came across the work of Ehrlich and Howe, who wrote the book, The Fourth Turning. And if you're familiar with that, you can Google that. And if you're not, and what it is essentially this, it's a timing method, but they didn't use astrology, they used history. They went through history and realized there were patterns in the generations, and these patterns last 20 years. And that's essentially a quarter of the chart in the timing system that I'm working with. So it aligns really well. They were working with an 80-year cycle, and I'm working with an 84-year cycle. But it's in a lifetime. It's essentially the same. It distributes pretty evenly. So that's why I call it the turning. But so if you start playing around with this, right, and you look at the phases of when the sun will set in the diurnal chart and rise in a nocturnal chart, you'll see that we spend 42 years using this system with the opposite light dominant, right? The non-dominant light becomes the dominant light for 42 years of our life. That's a long time to have the non-dominant light ruling over our lives. So it tells you that you're working quite a bit with the light that's challenging you the most. So that tells you if you're a nocturnal internal chart, you're going to spend a lot of time learning about this side of the chart, right? The diurnal external world. You are going to have to really work with this if you are nocturnal, and the reverse is true. If you're diurnal, you're going to have to spend a lot of time doing internal receptive work. And I like this picture because here's the diurnal kid putting out the energy, and here's the nocturnal kid receiving it, right? And this is the thing we do for most of our lives. We go back and forth with this in large chunks of time. So you will learn about sun when the moon dominates, and you'll learn about the moon when the sun dominates. So it's not like, oh, I have a diurnal and I don't have to pay attention to anything else. It's not quite like that. And those things will not always be perfect for you either. So, okay, so here are the improprieties I was talking about. Why do I use the word impropriety? So in the sect, in the traditional literature, the planets that are not in the sect that dominates, so they're not the ones in power, right? So that means for the diurnal births, the ones that are out of sect are the moon, Venus, and Mars, and Mercury when it rises after the sun. When it rises. I think I wrote this wrong before. I'll have to check that. I think I wrote that wrong. In any event, yeah, actually that's correct. So yeah, when Mercury rises after the sun, it's a nocturnal, it's a feminine nocturnal Mercury. So it's correct in this sect. So these are the planets that are going to give problems to the diurnal chart. And when I say problems, what I mean is improprieties. And improprieties are not bad things necessarily. They are just not appropriate for the situation at hand. So it's very situation dependent. So the moon, as we stated, will have issues of self-safeguarding, nurturing, caretaking, mothers or mothering. Diana had problems with this. I also have a diurnal chart. I didn't have problems with my mother. Diana had problems with her mother and her mother-in-law. I never had problems with my mother, but I did have problems with my mother-in-law. So the whole mothering thing can be an issue. With Mercury rising after the sun, there are disputes of internal matters because it's a nocturnal Mercury, a feminine Mercury. So knowledge and beliefs are internal things that we hold, ideas that we hold within ourselves. These can be challenged. Venus is interesting in a nocturnal, in a diurnal chart because, so Schmidt wrote, let me read it to you. I have it here. He wrote, where it is, just a sec. Okay. Just want to make sure the audio is still on. Where it is indicates unions based on a selection rather than the natural process of attraction. Now, what he makes it sound like is if you form a relationship or a union, it's, because you're selecting rather than through a natural process of attraction. And this can sound rather manipulative, but it doesn't have to be. So this can be just, for example, getting set up on a date. Or having an arranged marriage. With Diana, she has a diurnal chart, and she had an arranged marriage. Her marriage was not a natural process of attraction. It was arranged through the families because they thought it was a beneficial match to the families, right, to the royals. So there's an element of external benefit that comes into play, rather than simply, you just fell in love with that thing. And this is true also for the acquisitive side of Venus, like with regard to possessions, right? You can have people who externalize wealth, who might be, taken by, the luxuries, the things that make you look more. And this, it makes it sound like I'm putting a kind of a judgment on it, but I'm not. This is one way in which it can come out. It can also come out in other ways that have nothing to do with that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a negatively charged thing. Like in Diana's case, she was not any of those things. She wasn't, externalizing. She had externalized wealth just because of circumstance. So it can happen that way, that Venus becomes externalized through wealth, not by your choosing, but just by circumstance. But it does happen. So with Mars, another thing that can happen with Venus is like through dating through the internet, like so dating apps, right? Where you're not naturally falling in love with someone you just happen to see or meet, but there's an element of being hooked up through qualities that look good on paper, right? Like some dating sites will match you up because you look like you matched well with someone else. There's a scientific kind of process to it, and that's not the natural process of attraction. So that's an externalized way of doing Venus. With Mars, Schmidt says, and his stuff is all quoted, deliberate excision, exile from others. So this would be like, if there's a situation and you just leave a bad situation, either conflict, it doesn't have to be conflict or a bad situation, but if there's a situation where there's some kind of problem, you could just excise yourself from that situation. And Mars does tend to bring up conflict in the diurnal chart. So because it's extrinsically expressed, that break, but it doesn't have to be conflict. It can be just leaving a bad situation, which sometimes can be good. If you're in a violent situation, like in a relationship that's not very healthy, that's toxic, you might want to leave, and that would be a good thing to do. So it's not necessarily that the action is, and I wrote about this in a blog post on Mars that I recently wrote. You might want to read that because I talk about Mars out of sect and all of the situations that may actually justify that. So it's not that it's unjustified. Mars out of sect does not have to be unjustified, but it can be situations where you're exposed to conflicts that are inappropriate, right? Like situations where there's conflict that shouldn't be there. So you might want to leave, right, instead of fighting it, or because it's external. Another way in which it can come out is through singling out others to blame for your own problems, right? Instead of looking within and looking at what is causing the frustration and the anger and the conflict within, you might externalize it and then single out other people as the source of your own Mars issues. So this can come out in diurnal charts. And with Diana, of course, she had a lot of issues with in her marriage with Mars. not just with regard to her relationship with Prince Charles at the time, but also with her children, raising her children the way she wanted to raise them. So there were conflicts around that too. Okay, so here is her chart, and I wanted to show you the phase. So here's the phase of her first 7 years. And in her first 7 years, so she has the sun in the 8th. So when this Capricorn rises, and the chart turns this way, so when Capricorn rises, the sun will set, and this will be her new horizon. So the sun will be below. She will have no lights above. So that will be a difficult time for her. And it was, and because right around this time, at 7, her mother left the family for another man. Her mother abandoned the family, and there was a custody battle for the children, her and her brother. And her father, she lost her mother. Her father, she stayed with her father. And it was a very dark time for her because her father remarried shortly after that. She didn't get along with her stepmother. Another mother she had an issue with. So her own mother, her stepmother, and her mother-in-law, all three mothers, she had problems with. And her, like I said, her moon is corrupted, afflicted, if you want to say, same thing, through this Uranus and through, so Uranus brings the distance. Her mother actually left the family and moved far away with the lover. So this distance aspect is very much a part of this moon. And then the Neptune is this lack of transparency that happens with her and the royals, especially the Queen Mother. So yeah, so her challenges are going to be interpersonal and psychological. This had an impact on her. Her mother leaving had an impact on her own ability to do her moon. So she's going to have issues with self-safeguarding, fears of information inappropriately gathered or received. This was an issue with her own mother because her mother, in the court case, her mother's mother, so her maternal grandmother, testified against her daughter in favor of the son-in-law. And so that information inappropriately gathered and received starts out with an inappropriate betrayal like that, and then it gets, down the line in her history, it gets expressed through her fears of the media and all of that impropriety with people following her around and all of this. This happened with her own mother, with trying to get information to make her mother look bad. So there's patterns there that you can see in different ways. So the need to safeguard against her fears and anxieties. The moon also generates the 8th, right? Because it generates and this is a word I use for domicile rulership. That is the function of domicile rulership, which is why I'm using the word generate. The moon's function is to generate the things of the houses that it rules. So while it generates a wealth through other people, her marriage, it also generates fears, anxieties, and ultimately death. So her moon is quite important. And it involves the partner because of that overlap with the 7th, his money, as well as, issues of death through the landmines and through her own dangers. The moon as support, when she starts integrating her moon, becomes the collection of information and knowledge as a safeguard for herself and others. So it becomes the fulfillment of this Cancer sign, which is what the moon is supposed to do. It's supposed to fulfill the sign of the house. It generates the house and it fulfills the sign of the need. Venus in the 6th, remember I said unions formed not from natural processes but matchmaking, or that's exactly what this is. A union formed out of duty, which is the 6th house, right? Your duties, your obligations, rather than love. She felt obligated to marry into the royal family. I think she convinced herself she probably loved the prince. But I think there was a large element of, this is what you need to do. Mars and Pluto are going to be also problematic for her, and that is the coerced defense of her legal status. And I'm saying this because of the Pluto. The defense comes from Mars. It's the excision from her legal status, right? The removal from that bad situation, which she lost her title as princess through her divorce. But it was actually the right thing for her to do because Mars is part of her in the nocturnal. She was learning to do her Mars and to defend what was important to her, which were her kids. For the sake of her children. So the sun sets at age, I already mentioned this, so there are no lights above. And so it becomes a nocturnal chart with no lights above. So it's a bad time for her, that 7, until the moon rises again, which would be 7 years later. So the moon rised again in her teens. She married shortly after in this period here, in her 4th house period. She married during her Jupiter period, Jupiter ruled house period. So, yeah, okay. So now let's look at the improprieties of the nocturnal chart. And then you have the masculine planets. And this is where the sun, we already spoke about, errors of selection, issues with authenticity and executive function. We have disputes that over external matters, right? The Mercury rising before the sun. Now it's not so much about the beliefs and opinions and all of that, but about communications, contracts, trades. This is more externally oriented. Jupiter is really interesting, and I want to focus on Jupiter because the example I'm going to give you next of the case is about this Jupiter. Not only that, but it's a planet that there's a lot of problems with in today's society with this planet that we don't talk about enough because we only talk about the malefics in sect. And actually, Jupiter is a benefic, but Jupiter can actually be quite problematic. And you saw that actually the 2 examples I picked, the benefics caused a lot of havoc for these people, the out-of-sect benefics. In Diana's chart, it was her marriage that caused a lot of problems. In the example I'm going to give you, which is Elvis, Jupiter is the problem in his life. So Schmidt says, and let me explain why. Schmidt says, instability because too much is included. So this is like too much of a good thing. And why is that? Well, because when you select a path in a nocturnal, right, selection, you select your path, your sect mate is Jupiter. Jupiter will elevate and confirm, the confirmation principle is the Jupiter principle, that path. And that's correct because Jupiter's light, which is very expansive, right, can guide you on that path, for long distances. It likes to be focused and also it's expansive. So that focus and expansion can give you a lot of stability in the solar diurnal sect. In the nocturnal sect, because we have diffuse light and we have an enclosed situation, right? Because inclusion is part of the nocturnal, right? There's this enclosure. You move within, think of the nighttime and you move into the cave and you have this expansion of Jupiter, which is, it doesn't have limits. It's expansive. You have this diffuse light that goes everywhere. And so there's too much of that confirmation principle. There's too much of saying yes and not enough limits. So this is kind of like, cancer, where cells just multiply indefinitely and never stop. Jupiter needs to be directed and limited, which it is through Saturn and through the sun, through the selection principle in the daytime. In the nighttime, what happens with the Jupiter is that it turns into saying yes to everything. Overindulgences, addictions, naivety, which is saying yes to believing everything you hear, right? No skepticism. And so you can get taken advantage of with naivete, with, saying yes and believing in everything you're told. You can get in trouble with overconsumption, for example, which is a big problem in our society, where we just, are told, we're programmed to sort of buy. And if we don't put limits on that, that can also cause financial instabilities, right? Where you can't afford to buy. So we don't have limits. We just keep increasing our consumption and our credit cards and whatever. So I see problems in the spiritual community because of lack of skepticism and a lack of grounding. We say yes to too many things that we need to sometimes say no to. We need to have a bit more ability to to differentiate what's beneficial to us and what isn't. So Jupiter can be and is a problem in the spiritual community, where there are very big egos sometimes that take advantage of naivete. And so you see that, in the news sometimes when you have these false gurus with their cults taking advantage of a lot of very caring and believing people. So yeah, that can be a problem. Okay, and the last thing is Saturn. And Schmidt says exclusion by enclosure. I don't use the word exclusion as much as he does, but I can see that in a nocturnal chart it's appropriate. So what happens is that when you are in an enclosure, you use that as a way to keep away from what's outside. So it's exclusion by enclosure. It can create a sense of restriction and confinement, obstacles. This is the typical Saturn that creates obstacles. It can create outer world paralysis. It can create inability to set boundaries. The normal word I would use in a diurnal chart for Saturn, and I have words that I use depending on whether it's internal or external, but the Saturn word that I use in a diurnal chart is commitment, which is a good thing, right? And discipline, where you're committed to a path, you set your sights on a goal, and you just, are disciplined to get there. With the nocturnal chart, it's difficult to do that because of these obstacles that come up. And they're not always our fault, right? They're not always a lack of discipline. You can be a person that has discipline and that has the ability to set boundaries, but life hands you obstacle after obstacle, right? Restriction after restriction. So that becomes difficult to negotiate, but that is the challenge in the nocturnal chart. Okay, so here is the Elvis problematic Jupiter. And I like this chart because it's almost the reverse. It is the reverse of Diana's in some ways. He's also a Sag rising, and you'll recall that she had her sun here in Cancer setting, right? And he has a sun opposite in the second rising. So in the first 7 years of his life, he becomes a diurnal chart. He's nocturnal and he becomes diurnal, and hers is the opposite. In the first 7 years of her life, her diurnal chart becomes nocturnal. So, and because the first 7 years of his NTA are ruled by Sag, NTA is just the word I use for the ascendant in the turning. It becomes a different ascendant each 7 years. So this would be the NTA after when he turns 7. So here, in his first 7 years, it's ruled by Jupiter, right? So So Jupiter is going to be a really important planet in his chart. Now, because he's nocturnally oriented by birth, and there are no lights above for the first 7 years of his life, there's a dangerous situation in his early life. And the mother is pivotal. Why is she pivotal? Because she's literally in the pivot point of the chart. And she is. And when I looked at this chart and I saw this, and I didn't know anything about his early life, and I saw this Jupiter ruling the fourth, I saw the pivotal mother here disposed to the Jupiter. And by my grammatical rule, this Jupiter is his father. That's how we get the subject, is through the rulership. So this would embody his father in his life, in his first 7 years of life. Sometime during that period, it looked to me like his father was in jail. He's in the 12th. That's the house of imprisonment. And I didn't think it was like imprisonment of the mind. I thought he was literally in jail because of the sign. And I just wondered, I didn't know, was his father in jail when he was very young? And then I looked up in his bio, I have his bio, and I read it, and it was like, yeah, he was in jail in like when he was 2, I believe. I think between the ages of 2 and 4 or something like that. But he was very young, for writing a bad check. And it was an excessive sentence for such a petty crime. And he was in jail for writing a bad check because he was naive. And he believed, I don't remember the circumstances exactly, but he was kind of talked into it. Yeah, he went to jail. I think it was his boss that prosecuted him for writing the bad check. And so his mother, who was extremely dependent on the father, she's disposed to Jupiter, right? She was very weak and sickly, and kind of she's also was an alcoholic, which goes to this Jupiter as well. And there were a lot of family members that drank too much. Now, I forgot to say that they were very poor. The Presleys were extremely poor. They lived in poverty. And when his father went to jail, the mother was like, she didn't have any way of taking care of him. So it was a very dangerous situation. And they were bailed out by the church. The church came to their help. They were fed at the church. He learned how to sing at the church. You see that the sun rules the 9th, and it's rising here. So it became an integral part of their life, and it became his source of strength and her source of strength. And it was the music that he learned to sing in the church that cheered her up. And this whole quest to cheer up his mother became his mission to do in life. And it was helped along by this Jupiter, by his father being being in jail. And he also inherited his father's naivete. His father was very gullible and was very, sort of like, yeah, everything's going to be okay. Everything's always okay. And a little bit in denial, I think, about the dangers. And Elvis sort of inherited that optimism, turned it into a superpower to help his mother. And he was also reading lots of comic books at the time about this Captain Marvel Jr. that he imagined himself to be. And his mother would tell him how he was special and he would grow up to be this amazing. He was special because he was one of 2 twins that survived. And she constantly reminded him of that. That is also indicated by the fact that the moon here is in the 3rd house. So there's an overlap between 3 and 4th. So it's siblings as part of the family and the mother being there. So all of this is tied together. And this became his, as a very young boy, as a child really, became what he internalized. He internalized that he would be special. His singing was what would make him special. He believed that. So while the Jupiter ultimately led to his addictions. It was also what gave him his fame and stardom, this belief that he would overcome all of these early difficulties through the church and through the singing and through all of that. Now his challenges, because the Jupiter was excessive, right? The naivete, because of that, and the challenges would be the Jupiter, Saturn, the diurnal planets, right? So an overly expansive Jupiter, the need to be responsible, and the executive function, which he lacked. So while he was very talented, he wasn't very strong-willed, and he handed over that power. And that's part of what he missed from his father, was that ability to learn the strong will. Instead, he learned the Jupiter from his father. And he learned the will from his manager, Colonel Parker, who became like the father figure he never had. But the guy was not really, again, trusting too much. The guy was not trustworthy. And while he helped him make money, he also embezzled from him, and he kept him from making a lot of money abroad because he was hiding a secret. Colonel Parker was. He was involved in some shady, I think he was accused of murder in abroad in another country, and he was an illegal alien and couldn't go abroad. So he ended up being a problem for Elvis, and he actually probably encouraged some of the drug taking that ended up killing him. So mistakes from selection of resources and skills, the Sun, because he accepted everything the Colonel told him to do, and he didn't want to do a lot of the contracts. The Saturn is another problem here. And it represents the contracts that Colonel Parker would make, where he had to do a lot of movies that he didn't want to do. He wasn't allowed to write his own songs. He had to, because of the Colonel didn't want to lose money. I forget exactly what the dealings were, but he didn't give him full freedom to do what he wanted with music. So he was highly controlled by his manager. And that ultimately was a problem for him. So the planets that did cause him problems were these diurnal planets. Okay, so I think that is the last slide I have. I hope that was helpful to you. I hope that this went slower, that you can actually read the slides. And I am going to put this up on YouTube as well, so that you can watch it there. And if you have any comments or questions, and that you didn't get a chance to ask, for the people who were at the presentation a couple of nights ago, if you think of anything you didn't get a chance to ask and you want to ask, you can leave it in the YouTube comments and I'll respond there. And anyone else who watches it, feel free to leave comments as well. All right, thanks a lot, guys.